Hey everyone, welcome to week 10 of creating chord progressions. This is actually going to be our final lesson of the course, so for all of you that have been following along with each one of these courses, I'd just like to thank you for making it through each individual lesson, taking in the information as it comes, and for those of you that are skipping around, which is completely okay, I encourage it a lot of times on my lessons, and I try to have them be sequential but also be providing information that you can kind of tune in at any point. I hope you've gotten some good information thus far, and I can continue to provide that in this lesson. So thank you again. And without further ado, let me actually kind of get into the meat and potatoes of what we'll be talking about in this lesson. So our last lesson, lesson 9, was called The Rules of Pop. And basically what we were talking about was, kind of what I almost think of as the early 2000s, mid-2000s era of pop music. Artists like Jason Mraz really come to my mind. And this is a lot of like acoustic singer-songwriting stuff where we have all of these chord progressions going on that are moving around within our number system, but we're trying to keep some consistent voices happening in the B string and the E string. And in doing that, I'm able to, again, create chord movements that are, going through all of our numbers, that are kind of, outlining our typical chord progressions that we might encounter in pop music, but there's also a lot of consistency that occurs, and the reason that consistency happens is, again, because, you could remember from last lesson, we were trying to keep the same notes on the B string and E string for each individual chord. The reason for that is, typically, I think we hear our ears naturally gravitate towards the highest pitch that's happening on an instrument, or the lowest pitch, depending on where you're at, but our ears are naturally kind of gravitating towards that highest pitch, so when we hear those notes stay the same in between, most of the chords, or just shift slightly between chords, it has this really kind of, resolved sound where even though I'm going between chords, even though I'm making movement, it really sounds like my chord progression is kind of staying in one place. And again, the reason that we might want something like that is that it can free the singer up to really command control. And even though our chord progression is moving under them, the vocal is really the focus, which is a lot of pop music. And additionally, when you're doing something like that, a lot of pop music has really, really, complex arranging going on. There's a lot of different instruments. A lot of pop producers are going for a very, what you could call, maximist point of view, where they want a lot of different elements happening at once that are all cohesive, so nothing's really at the center. They're all just kind of forming this big solid brick that the vocalist can sit over. This is, again, another great strategy to do that, because your instrument isn't occupying so much sonic space, even though you're kind of creating these harmonies, resolving things. They all kind of stay nice and consistent, so if you were to come up with a piano part, you might not have to think, as hard about how you can voice stuff out, because you're lowering, how much dynamics you have in your guitar part and how all the resolutions are working. And so what we're going to do in this lesson, this is going to be another take on pop music. Now, you shouldn't interpret this as, parts 1 and 2. After these 2 lessons, you'll know everything about pop music. It's definitely not the case, and pop is an extreme umbrella term, so it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I'm just focusing on certain aspects of things that I hear in music today. So like I said, last lesson, even though this is, maybe associated with an artist like Jason Mraz, whose big songs, I guess, happened, close to 10 years ago, for the year 2021, which obviously doesn't seem that long ago for most of us. But anyway, since, even though some time has passed, that style is still very, very prevalent in today's music. And something that I'd also like to talk about in this lesson, which is kind of a departure, it's not really building off of the last lesson, we're just going to kind of depart from that, is we're going to talk about more of another modern style of pop music. And this is really pop music that I think primarily comes from hip-hop and also has a little bit of influence from jazz and gospel music. So, really anytime you turn on the radio today, it could be someone like Ariana Grande, it could be an artist like Summer Walker, any of really the big top 40 hits. A lot of them, I see a lot of these consistencies that are happening, and there's a lot of kind of reused patterns that are going on. So I'd like to take this lesson to talk about that. And mainly what we're going to talk about is using chords with extensions, and how we can kind of, almost take some of these aspects of that might be in traditional soul music, traditional gospel music, stuff that has been like sampled from jazz music and hip hop, all of these different elements, and you kind of just take a little bit of it, again, getting back to that sampling nature, and that becomes basically the essence of your progression. So for any of you that might have listened to jazz music before, there's a ton of different movements that happen within jazz music that can be, a little hard to follow, or it can give the music, you know, kind of this sense of constant resolution and tension. And what some of the classic hip-hop producers and just, you know, all-around producers in general started doing when sampling became a thing was they said, well, this is like, all of the movement that's happening here is beautiful, but I want to take just this 10 seconds that, you know, Herbie Hancock played on his piano. And even though this was just a momentary thing that he was expressing in, you know, a song of all of these resolutions and tensions, I'm just going to take this little bit because it sounds nice to me, and I'm going to make that the basis of my entire song. So we're going to see some progressions here that might be typically associated with jazz music or something, but we're not going to, you know, it's not going to be one of a bunch of progressions. It's not going to be a 32-bar form or anything. We're just going to take individual elements. So we're going to talk about a couple simple progressions, and mainly we're going to do that by talking about how we can use chord extensions. And we've already talked about sevenths. We're actually going to get a little bit bigger and start talking about nines, and also how we can use alterations on dominant chords. So to start this off, I just want to be in what I guess I would consider maybe our most basic key of C major. And what I'm first going to do is I'm just going to revisit how we would play the entire key of C major, but with our seventh chords, right? And so we won't be doing any inversions. And when you think about it, this lesson is actually kind of working conversely from how our last lesson worked. Before we were saying, how can we, you know, occupy the least amount of space so that we can create all these chord progressions with movement that feel like they aren't really occupying what the listener is gravitating towards. This, on the other hand, is how can I maybe create a 2 or 3 chord progression, but I'm putting a lot of color tones in them so that it sounds really, really interesting and my ear is drawn to it, even though I'm really only playing 3 chords. So again, let's work in the key of C major here. So I'm going to start off with a C major 7. So if you remember, my 1 chord is a major chord, and if I was to add that 7th degree, the 7th note of the major scale, I would get this C major 7 chord. So to play this, I have the 3rd fret of the A string, the 5th fret of the D string, the 4th fret of the G string, the 5th fret of the B string, and then I'm also barring my 1st finger so that I can get that 3rd fret of the high E string. Now, if I wanted to, I wouldn't have to bar. I could actually just play right up here to the B string, and I would have all the notes that I needed in the C major chord. This is actually just a repeat, this G note of the 5th that's naturally occurring in C major. But it is really nice to kind of bar your finger down, because then you also have the option, this is something I've shown in a couple of lessons, a lot of times when I play my major 7 chord, I'll do this little hammer-on motion, and this can kind of get into, again, something that's actually very indicative of the style we're talking about today. Even though I'm playing 1 chord, you could hear I added all that little movement with my pinky finger in some of these trills. So that's my 1 chord. My 2 chord was traditionally a minor triad, and when we add the 7th, it becomes this minor 7 chord, right? So this is the 5th fret of the A string, the 7th fret of the D string, the 5th fret of the G string, the 6th fret of the B string, and then the 5th fret of the high E string. And this is a D minor 7. This is my 2 chord of C major. Again, I'm freeing my pinky up, so if I wanted to do any of those trills, I'm, you know, more than able to. And this is one of the chords where, you know, I still have to bar no matter what if I want to play this specific voicing. If you did want to simplify things, you know, I wouldn't technically need that high E string. Again, that's just my 5th repeating here, this A note. But it is nice to, again, just get comfortable barring the whole chord, because maybe you actually want that note to be your melody note, or again, maybe you want to experiment a little bit more with some of those trills. So our 1 chord was C major 7. Our 2 chord was D minor 7. Our 3 chord is going to be E minor 7, so we're not doing the inversion here like we've done in previous weeks. We're just going to kind of stick to the standard numbers. So this is going to be my E minor chord. So to play this, it's actually the same thing as my D minor. I'm just shifting it up a whole step. So to play this, I have the 7th fret of the A string, the 9th fret of D, 7th fret of G, 8th fret of B, and then the 7th fret of the high E string. Again, just the same voicing here. Now I'm going to get up to my F chord. This is my 4 chord. And I'm going to do this particular voicing, same exact one that I was doing here for C major. So for this F major, that's the 10th or the 8th fret of the A string. That's the 10th fret of the D string. That's the 9th fret of the G string. The 10th fret of the B string, and then I'm barring my 1st finger so that I can play that 8th fret of the high E string. And again, if I wanted to do any trills or anything, or kind of do a little interplay with my pinky, I'm more than welcome to do that. Next, we'll get up to our G chord. For this one, I'm actually going to flip over here. Again, just to simplify things, I'm actually going to do it all now using the E string as a root note. Instead of just going all up on one string, I'm actually going to come over here to play this G chord. So to play my G dominant 7, right? So this was an instance where if I was just playing the triad, my F and my G, I could have used the same voicing, right? They were both just major triads, but when I add that 7th degree, this is where they're going to depart, because where my F major chord was a major 7, my G chord is going to be a G dominant 7. So that means the same exact thing as a major 7, it's got the major triad, but the 7 is actually flatted. So it's a flat 7 instead of a major 7. So to play this dominant 7 chord, it's actually pretty much as simple as if you're comfortable with your normal G bar chord, I just have to lift up my pinky and I'm playing a dominant 7. So that's the 3rd fret of the E string, the 5th fret of the A string, the 3rd fret of the D string, the 4th fret of the G string, and then the 3 of the B and the E. And if I want to too, I can also add my pinky there. And when I play this chord personally, I'm usually just doing something like this. This is what you'll notice. I'm actually just skipping the 5th because, as we've talked about in some of our lessons, you know, when we get into these bigger chords where I'm using 4, 5, even 6 notes, I only have 6 strings. And in addition to that, even though I have 6 strings, it's not like everything always lines up perfectly on the guitar. It might actually be impossible to stretch to play every single note within a chord, or one that just doesn't really make sense to play in the moment in a song. So in figuring that stuff out, I can say to myself, okay, are there some notes that I can omit? And usually the 5th, if we're just talking about a normal perfect 5th, is the first note that we would omit because it doesn't really reinforce anything, right? Or I guess all it really does is, add a little bit of power, but it's a very consonant interval. It's not like the 3rd, which gives the chord its personality that tells us if it's major or minor, or the 7th, which makes a very important distinction between a major 7 and a minor 7 chord. So our 5th is usually our first one to go. That's how I come up with this little position here. All right, now we're going to go up to our 6th chord, which is A minor 7, and if we remember as well, our A minor 7, or our A chord, our 6, is our relative minor. So if I was in the key of A minor, it would be all of the same exact chords as the key of C major. So this is my A minor 7 chord. To do this, I'm playing the 5th fret of the E string, and then the 5th fret of the D, G, B, and E string. And so to do this, again, if you're having trouble, a lot of times when people are first getting into these positions, you can go, how on earth am I supposed to cram my hand, all into one fret? So I would always start with the ring finger, with the higher strings first, and then it's almost like you're reaching over with your middle finger. If you do it the opposite way, it can be very easy to fret your first finger and then go, well, how am I supposed to, put my ring finger here? Your ring finger is usually the focus, and then your middle finger comes over. And again, when you do that, you can see I'm doing a little bit of a mixed style of playing where I'm playing the bass note with my pick and then using my fingers to just kind of strum the B and E string, D string. I'm actually not being very particular here. I'm just kind of generally playing the chord, almost strumming it. But if I did want to do just a kind of conventional strum, when I play it like this, I'm muting the A string, so it's not going to ring out in the same way as the other strings. Okay, so we have our 1 chord, which is a major 7. Our 2 chord is a minor 7. Our 3 chord's a minor 7. Our 4 chord is a major 7. Our 5 chord is a dominant 7. Our 6 chord's a minor 7. And now I'll come back up here to just play my half diminished chord because I like this voicing more than the one that occurs on the E string. This is going to be 2nd fret, 3rd fret, 2nd fret, 3rd fret. So that's 2, 3, 2, 3. And if we remember our half diminished chord, basically what's happening here is it's almost like our minor 7 chord. If you look, even though we play these in very different ways, there's only one note that's different, right? It's that 5th. So it's 1 flat 5, minor 3rd, flat 7. So it's the same exact thing as our minor triad, except the 5 is flat. So it's just one note different. And that's how we get this half diminished chord before we resolve back to our 1. So again, if we were to just play each one of those individually, I have my 1, which is a major 7, my my 2 is a minor 7, my 3 is a minor 7, my 4 is a major 7, my 5 is this dominant 7, my 6 is a minor 7, my 7 chord is a half diminished chord, or we can also call it minor 7 flat 5, and then back to my 1 chord, right? So, and you can hear whenever I put extensions on it, right, I'm doing the opposite of what I was doing last week. I'm avoiding some of these inversions and some of these things that really make all the chords sound like they're kind of just part of one chord in a way, right? Before, when I played my 3 chord, I was doing this. I was playing just the 1 chord as a first inversion so that it felt like I wasn't actually doing a lot of movement. Now when I add all of these extensions and I take out all of the inversions, you can hear my chord progression, again, has a lot of movement. It's not just staying in the same place. Again, why I kind of said that this lesson is almost, you know, the antithesis of what we were talking about in our last lesson. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go one step higher. We're going to say on each one of these chords, how can I add a certain extension that might give it a little bit more color and flavor, right? And so in doing this, I'm now going to think about the next interval that will occur. And we've done a little bit of this before, but I just want to review because I know this can be a kind of a confusing concept. We're mainly going to be talking about how we can add 9s. And when I say the term 9, that's confusing to some of us because we go, wait, our major scale has only 7 notes. And for the most part, when we were constructing these chords, we were just counting up to 7. We were going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And even though it was a flat 7 in some of our chords, right, and we don't have a flat 7 in our major scale, we can still see it as, okay, well, I go up to my 7, you know, my normal major 7, and then I flatten it. That's how I get it. How would I get something like a 9, though, if I'm really only talking about 7 notes? And our thought process is, as we add these higher extensions, they're actually just going to be other notes from our major scale or that are based off of our major scale. But when we get these notes, it would be a little weird to say, so this is going to be the first chord we talk about, and I'll break down in a second. It'd be a little weird to say, well, this is a C major 7, 2, because the second note of my major scale is on top here. That's a little odd to say, right? And it kind of almost doesn't describe the chord well because 2 we think of as lower in our major scale, but we're really using it as an extension. So the thought process is, well, let me just play my normal C major scale of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and now I'm at my major 7. Instead of going back and going 1 again, I'm actually just going to count up again. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's why I'm calling my 2 a 9. I'm actually just adding the number 7 to it, right, to make 7, 8, 9. And that's how I get that interval. So the 3 intervals that we usually talk about, and again, we could flatten these and we could sharpen these, and we're going to see this actually in this progression, but whenever I talk about these different intervals, the 3 ones that are going to come up are going to be our 9, which is just my 2, my 11, which is actually just my 4, and then my 13, which is just my 6. And you can see we get all those by just adding 7. It's the same thing as just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It's actually just my 2 again, right? So that's the thought process here. So when I say I'm adding a 9 to most of these chords, I'm actually going to be taking the second note of the scale. And now you're going to see as I play through these, I'm not going to add a 9 to each individual chord. There's some where it just doesn't, for instance, you're going to see on the 3 chord, I actually don't have a major or a normal 9 occurring on that chord. I would actually have to raise it. And that also gets a little bit ambiguous because then I'm getting in the way of some vital tones. So for the most part, I'm just going to play the chords that I think naturally have a 9 that work within the chord progression. I'm also going to show you something that's called a 13, which again is just the 6, only on some certain chords, actually more specifically pretty much just the dominant chord. So I'm going to play through the same progression and I'll lay it out. Some of the chords are just going to stay the same because adding an alteration or an additional extension to them is a little bit more difficult, or, you know, the typical voicings that I'm using here aren't going to work for them. But for the ones where I do think there is a good opportunity to show these new voicings, I will be doing that. So we're going to start off with what was our major 7 chord, and now all I'm going to do is add a 9 to it. And if you remember from what I was saying before, well, now we're getting into a chord that has our 1, our major 3, our 5, our major 7, and our 9. This is 5 notes. That's quite a bit of notes on our guitar, right? And to actually play all those intervals, I would usually have to do a pretty spaced out voicing, and I don't actually want to do that. I want to create something that's kind of condensed, so I'm going to do what I just talked about before. I'm going to say, you know, this fifth is great, but it actually doesn't add a ton to this chord, and I don't really need it to, you know, explain this relationship. So even though a major 9 chord does have a fifth, I can actually get away without playing it. So that's why I have this voicing. So to play this one, I have the 3rd fret of the A string, the 2nd fret of the D string, the 4th fret of the G string, and then the 3rd fret of the B string. And if I wanted to, too, I could even do something like this, which happens a lot. So you'll notice I'm actually barring my 1st finger on the 2nd fret of the D and G string, so I can do this little hammer-on motion from my 6th to my major 7. So this is a very common trope that you see a lot of times when guitar players play major 9 chords, and I think it's even more specifically probably taken from how piano players interpret chords, because, you know, when you have all of your individual fingers playing a chord like that, the ability to do something a little bit more dynamic where you can play a chord but maybe move a middle voice happens a lot with piano players. So something like this is really kind of mimicking that idea, and again, why I always try to get comfortable barring so that I can really free myself up to do some dynamic stuff with my chords. So that's my 1 chord, which is a C major 9. Now I'm going to go to my 2 chord. So before this was just a D minor 7. Let me do the same thing. I'm actually just going to add a normal 9 to the top of this and make this chord. An awesome chord, very jazzy, very, you know, associated with a lot of different styles of music, but a minor 9 chord really adds, you know, this whole other element and coloration to a chord. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, my 3rd right here, my minor 3rd and my 9, they're right next to each other, so how on earth am I supposed to play the 9 if I want to play my 3rd? Because that's one of the notes I can't really omit, right? And so what I'm doing here is I'm saying, well, my 5th was here, I also have a flat 3 right here, so now the intervals are the 1, the D note, the flat 3, the flat 7, and the 9. So it's basically the same thing as the major 9, where I'm just saying, let me just omit that 5th because now I'm playing a lot of notes, but I still want to have a condensed chord that'll fit just on 4 strings. So that's the 5th fret of the A string, the 3rd fret of the D string, the 5th fret of the G string, and then the 5th fret of the B string to get a D minor 9. Right, you can hear as I play these, a lot of coloration is happening with these. Now we're going to get to our 3 chord. This note, this would actually be a sharp 4, right? So you can hear, if I was to play this voicing as a 9 as well, right? It's actually kind of a cool tension if that's what you're looking for, but I am technically now working outside of the major scale. So for the most part, I'm actually just going to avoid this because, again, if you're someone that says, I want to add some of these colorations to a chord progression, it's important to know where a 9 naturally does not occur, so that if you were to play this 3 chord with a 9, you'd go, I know I'm doing something where I'm deliberately adding, you know, this note that does not go with the key to create tension. So for now, we're actually just going to play a normal minor 7, so that when we play through this, in our mind we go, this 3 is actually just normal. And again, if I wanted to add a 9, that would have to be a very deliberate choice to make a substitution. Now we're going to get up to our 4 chord, and it's actually just going to be the same exact voicing that we were using for our 1 chord. Right? So I'm doing the 8th fret with my A string, the 7th fret with my D string, the 9th fret with my G string, and then the 8th fret with my B string. And again, if I want to, I'm going to bar here so that I can do that pretty little hammer-on motion. All right, now we're going to get up to our dominant chord, and this I'm going to make a 9 chord. So to do this, and this one we kind of saw from our funk lesson, right? I have all this pretty coloration that's going on here. So this is the 10th fret of the A string, the 9th fret of the D string, and then the 10th fret of the G, B, and E string. And then if I want to, if I'm feeling really bold, I can add the 13 here. So this 13, and now look at all these intervals, right? I have my 1, my major 3rd, my flat 7, the 9, and the 13. This has so many color tones to it, and it's why James Brown was able to create songs that pretty much just relied on this one chord because there's so much color and movement to it that, even though we're just staying in place the whole entire time, it sounds so full and is something that can be relied on as just the single chord that will happen in a verse or something like that. So again, if I want to lift up, I can do my pinky to make it a 13. Let me also play a 13 voicing here. This is another just amazing dominant chord. So I'm actually not playing the 9 here. I'm playing my 1, my flat 7, my major 3rd, and then just skipping up to the 13. So you can hear, especially the more and more you get up to all these chords, you can do a lot of mixing and matching. So for instance here I'm saying, it sounded awesome playing the 9 and 13 together. What if I just played the 13? And you can see when you get into these bigger extensions, you sometimes reach all these dilemmas where you go, wow, I could add a lot of different voicings to this chord, right? And there's really a lot of mixing and matching I can do. And it's not really just this, when we were working with triads, it was pretty cut and dry of saying, I can either play the triad or at these special instances I could maybe do an inversion. But now it's, well, which one of all of these color tones do you want to mix and match? And there's a lot of different reasons why you might want to use one or the other. But for our purposes, we're just going to use these 2 dominant chords. So to play this one, this is the 3rd fret of the E string, 3rd fret of the D string, 4th fret of G, 5th fret of B. And again, I'm just kind of bringing my first finger over so that if I wanted to strum it, I would be muting that A string. All right, now we're going to get to an A minor chord, and this we're also going to add a 9 to. So there's a couple different ways we can play this, and there's advantages and disadvantages to both. So we could play it, if I was to just play my traditional bar chord like this, right, my minor 7 chord, I can add my pinky here. And this is great. This can also be really, really difficult for some people because not only are we using our pinky, which is sometimes, not the most commonly used finger and not a finger that we have a lot of strength in, because if we were to avoid one of our fingers, usually guitar players would neglect the pinky first because it's the smallest, unfortunately. But it does actually free us up to still be muting that A string, and we don't have to think about it as something drastically different from our minor 7 chord, right? Now the other voicing we can do is this one. So what I'm doing is I'm actually just barring with my first finger across all of the strings, and then using my ring finger here. And this can do a couple of cool things. I have all these different fingers that are free now, and all these really, really kind of cool modern runs that you hear people do. They really work and they're conducive to this position. The only thing I have to look out for now, though, is in doing this, my A string is no longer muted. And for the most part, I don't really want to include that tone. It's a 4th, and again, we could do something like a minor 11 chord. I'm not going to get too much into that, but because it's so low in the guitar, it's easy for our ear to interpret this as the bass note, and that would create a completely different chord. A really cool one, but we're not going to get too into that. So for the most part, if I do want to do this voicing, I have to do some sort of mixed style, or when I'm strumming, I have to really deliberately skip that A string, which, isn't a problem always. If you're playing with a bass player, I can say, well, I don't really need to play the root note. It's going to be implied anyway, so I can kind of just play up here and do my thing. So that's our minor 7 chord. And then for our half diminished chord, we're just going to keep it simple, just what we were doing before. Our minor 7 flat 5 has, our 7th chord has so much tension already in it that we don't really need to add too many color tones in my mind to make it different. There are really cool substitutions you can do here with color tones, but again, I'm going to try to keep it just a little bit simpler because I know we're already doing some complicated stuff within this chord progression. So my 1 chord, which is a major 7, I have my 2 chord, which is a minor 7, a minor 9, sorry. I have my 3 chord, which is a minor 7, my 4 chord is a major 9, my 5 chord is a dominant 9, or I can make it a 13, and if I was to play it here, it would just be a dominant 13, no 9. Then I have my A minor 9 as my 6th chord, my 7 chord is just a normal half diminished, and then back up to my 1, which I just played as a major 7, but let me play it again as a major 9. Now, for this next portion, I'm not going to try to scare us too much with alterations, but I'd actually just like to play the chord progression that I prepared for today. And in listening to this, I'm going to break down what I'm doing with this special alteration, and we'll talk about what those are. But let me just play the progression first, and then we'll break down what's happening. Alright, so let's break down what's going on in this chord progression. So this is all within the key of D minor here. And I'm going to start off just playing this chord right here. So this is a major 7 chord, and if you want to, so this is B flat major 7. If we were in the key of D minor, this would be our 6th chord, right? It would be B flat major 7, and that's also the relative major of this. So all of the chords of B major or B flat major 7, they're exactly the same as the chords of our D minor 7. Oops, sorry. Scratch that 1 second. That's actually not the case. It would be more like our F major chords, but you get the point here. So we are starting on our 6th chord of the minor key, right? So we're starting on the 6th chord of our minor key, which is going to be B flat major 7. And I'm doing a special voicing here. I'd encourage you, if you're still getting comfortable with some of these crazier voicings, to just stick to the normal major 7. But if you really feel like you want to push yourself, you can try the voicing that I was doing. And the reason I liked it is because it puts the 9 all the way at the top. So what I'm doing here, and I could also just play, the top part of this voicing. So it's my normal major 7 voicing up here, where I'm playing the 8th fret of the A string, of the D string, the 7th fret of the G string, the 6th fret of the B string, and the 5th fret of the high E string, and then I'm wrapping my thumb around, kind of Jimi Hendrix style, to play that root note on the E string. Now if you wanted to, I could play all these notes, and I'm actually just repeating that root note, so I don't technically need to play that. I just like it because it kind of reinforces the other chords that I'm doing. So I have my 1 chord here, my 6th chord. Now I'm going to my 5 chord of the key, right? Because we're in the key of D minor, so this is just a normal A minor 7. And then I'm going to a G minor 9. So in doing that, I'm barring my first finger across, and then using my pinky to play that 9, right? And then I'm also lifting my pinky up so that I can hear that top part of the voicing. I'm doing that same kind of pick style, right, where I'm basically just starting with my thumb, and then I'm planting my first finger on the G string, my middle finger on the B string, my ring finger on the E string, and just doing, it's almost like a kind of flamenco or classical roll, but I kind of just abruptly stop at that top note so that it sounds like this kind of nice little melodic arpeggio almost. So that's the entirety of my first progression, right? It's only 3 chords, but because I'm using some of these extensions, it sounds really interesting and our ear is drawn to it. Again, there's not really a jazz standard where you would just play 3 chords like this that are harmonically working together. That might be one very particular part of the song, but again, something that happened a lot is, producers of the 90s and the 2000s would say this is an awesome progression. I think it would sound great to just take this little bit of a jazz song or maybe recreate it in some other way if they weren't sampling, and then have that be the basis of our song. So we're in the key of D minor, and I'm just playing 6, 5, 4. So that's our whole entire first progression. Now we're going to do this. We're going to play 1. again, using that kind of mixed style. And this is a D minor 9 chord. Then I'm going to go up to my G minor 7, which is going to be my 4 chord. So, and here's where it gets fun. So I'm playing an altered dominant chord. And what an altered dominant chord is it's basically saying, okay, I had some of all of these really cool color tones, right, when I was playing a normal dominant chord. Here, let me actually break this up into 2 parts. So for one, I'm using a dominant chord as my 5. And if we remember our numbers a little bit, well, the only dominant chord that would naturally be occurring would be our flat 7, right? And you saw moments earlier I was playing a normal minor 7. What I'm basically doing here is I'm saying, well, I really like the sound of a dominant chord resolving to our 1, right? It's really the basis of a lot of our chord progressions that are happening within our major key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to borrow that a little bit. I'm going to say, what if I actually made this my dominant chord? What if I actually made that my 5 chord instead of a minor 7, so that I could get that same feeling of resolution? And there's a couple different, we could say that this is modal interchange with the major key. We could say that we're borrowing a little bit from, harmonic minor or melodic minor. The only way I'm going to put it is just, we like the sound of a dominant chord resolving back to a 1 chord, so why not make our 5 chord a dominant chord? So that's the thinking there. So it's very basic. We could just play our dominant chord going to our 1. And we're going to take it a step further. We're going to make an alteration. And what an alteration says is, well, I just introduced all of these different color tones, right? Namely my 9, my 4, and my 6. And instead of just playing a standard 6, what if I either sharpened it, which really wouldn't do a lot in this circumstance, right? That's actually kind of just our 7. But what if I flattened it like this? And now you can see this chord has a lot of tension to it, and in doing that, it resolves very beautifully to this 1 chord, because I'm putting these 2 notes here that are very much not within a D minor chord, and then they just resolve perfectly down to my D minor chord. So again, this is like taking a very, very specific and small part of jazz harmony. Alterations are something that are extremely common on dominant chords. They're, really the basis of a lot of jazz musician substitutions really revolve around dominant chords and how you can alter them, and how, even those alterations can be interpreted as different substitutions that the bass player then can replicate. There's a lot of different thinking behind it, but I want to keep it simple and just introduce one simple alteration, which is saying this was our 13 chord. I'm just going to flatten this 13 chord as my dominant 5 chord, going back to a 1 chord, and you can hear it just has a really, really nice resolution to it. Right? Again, just taking a very, very particular piece of jazz harmony, something that might happen a lot throughout an entire song, and saying, what if we just took this one element and we made it basically the basis of an entire verse or an entire chord progression? So let's hear this once more over the backing track. you have it. Again, the basis of what we're doing here is we're saying, let's take something that's maybe a little bit complicated, adding these extensions that go past P on our 7, like our 9s, our 4, our 9s, our 11s, and our 13s. But let's just make them simple 3-chord progressions and see if we can really let, all the colors that happen within our different chords be the basis of our resolution. So even though, you might think 3-chord progression, that sounds super simple, maybe like a very simple blues or something like that. And it's actually, if you think about it, since we're just playing them in a row, it might be even simpler than a blues since there's not as much of a form to it. But because we're adding all of these different color tones to it, it's something that you can play over and over again because there's a lot of interesting resolution that's happening. And additionally, the other thing that we saw was adding alterations, right? And again, I didn't want to overload us because alter dominants are their whole other world and they can sound really, really confusing and specific. But basically, the basis of what we were doing here was saying, well, for one, instead of just playing a minor chord here, I'm going to make it a dominant chord in my minor key, resolving back to my 1. And on top of that, I'm going to say, I know I was normally playing a 13, let me flatten that. And I get this nice color tone that adds a little bit of tension, but really resolves beautifully to the 1 chord. And there are other types of, alterations I can do. I could make my 4 a sharp 4. I could make my 9 a flat 9 or a sharp 9, and then I can start mixing and matching all of these different alterations. And that stuff's great. I just wanted to keep it really simple and just do one that I think is really classic and sounds great. In my mind, something I love to do when I'm doing something like a minor 2-5-1. So again, thanks so much for making it all the way to the end of this course. And once more, we'll open it up for questions. I know there was a lot of information in today's lesson, as well as the entire course. So any information that you want me to convey to you, any questions you have, any comments you have, either about today's lesson or the entire course, please pass that along and I'll get it answered for you. Hey everyone, so we're back. So any comments or questions you might have about today's lesson, anything that we've talked about in this course in general, please pass that along and I'll get it answered for you. And I think we have our first couple of questions coming in now, so let me check. So what's the best way to play a major 7 chord root on the 6th string? Okay, so that's a great question. So generally, like I said, today we saw this voicing of the major 7 chord, right? Which is great, but like I said, I kind of have to do some workarounds with my thumb. Some people might not think that that's the greatest technique, and even if it is something that you can achieve, you might in the moment have some trouble getting to it. So another great voicing, and this is kind of, if you were to open up any kind of guitar method book or talk to anybody about a basic major 7 chord that will be based off of a root position on the E string, they would probably give you a chord that looks basically like this. So this is the 6th fret of the E string, the 7th fret of the D string, the 7th fret of the G string, and then the 6th fret of the B string. And the way that I'm playing this is, again, this is one of these weird chords where I'm skipping the A string with a root note on the E string. So at first I'm just going to kind of voice out what's happening on the D, G, and B string, and then I'll reach over with my first finger, right? So we've talked about this chord a little bit throughout this course, and this is always a good refresher to kind of go back to what this voicing looks like. Because again, there are different applications for both of these chords. You can hear this has a much, the major 7 is on top, so our ear is really naturally gravitating towards it, as opposed to this one, where the major 7 is kind of more internal within the chord. But either one really works. It just depends on the application and what you want that chord to sound like. All right, let's see. I think we have another question coming in here. But yeah, basically, whenever we're playing a major 7 chord like this, it really, like the top note that you're hearing in any of these voicings is really going to be, I think what makes this chord sound the way that it does, right? So the big difference between these two chords was that major 7 that was happening on top, right? So when I was doing this chord where the major 7 was more internal, we hear that tension a little bit lower in the chord, and it can be really cool for some certain things, but for today's example, I really wanted to have that major 7 in the top so it had a nice shine, and also that it had, some nice void sleeting in between, this chord and this chord, right? Because it's, something that I've always really liked when I have the top voice of a chord kind of working in conjunction with the top voice of another chord. Oh, and let me just turn my overall volume up here as well. All right, looks like we have another question. Why don't you ever see a 10 extension? Okay, great question. And someone actually asked something kind of similar to this in a previous question. So if I was to figure out what a 10 would be, right, basically what I do is I start on my major scale and I'm going to play in 2 octaves. And when I play it in 2 octaves, I'm going to continue to go up after I get to 7. So I'm not just going to say 1 again. I'm going to go 8, 9, 10, right? So if I was in the key of A major, right, this would be my 1. So I'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then instead of saying 1 again, let me say 8, 9, 10. So my 10 is actually my third. And in that way, we wouldn't really ever say a 10 extension, because for the most part, whenever we're talking about, any of these chords with extensions, the third is already implied within it, right? If I was playing a G9 chord, a G dominant 9 chord, right, with this 9 in the top voicing, I wouldn't really say a G9, 10 because the major third is already implied by the dominant chord. So for the most part, we wouldn't really say, we wouldn't really use a 10 for the most part as an extension. Now, the only circumstance where we do actually use a third, and this can get a little confusing, is when we talk about, this is another type of dominant chord. It's often called the Jimi Hendrix chord because it's one of his favorite chords, and, most famously probably in Purple Haze. So this is a sharp 9 chord, and if we were to think about what a sharp 9 is, so this is a dominant 7 sharp 9. So let's break it down piece by piece. So E dominant 7 sharp 9. What that means is we have a major triad. All right, it's a dominant 7, so we have a flat 7. So those are our first 4 intervals. Now let's talk about what would a sharp 9 constitute. Well, we already know what a 9 is, and if I was to sharpen it, that's actually the same as my minor third. So it's kind of weird what's happening with these chords is we're playing a dominant 7 chord, but with a minor third on the top. So that's the one circumstance where, we might use something that would call a 10. You wouldn't call it a flat 10. Nobody really has ever said that before, but that's mainly why we stay away from the 10 as an extension name. We pretty much are only going to stick to 9, 11, and 13 for those names. Let's see. We've got a question up here. Ooh, a 2-part question. I love it. So, at the end, you said the A7 sharp 5 has no shared notes with D minor on the B and G strings, but the minor third of D minor is on the B string. Is it true that there is nothing in common with the voicing used for D minor 9, making the voice important for the voice leading? Okay, kind of a long question. Let me read that once more so I can just make sure I'm answering it right. So, at the end, you said the A7 sharp 5 has no shared notes with the D minor on the B and G strings, but the minor third of the D minor is on, okay, yep. Is it true that there is nothing in common with the voicing used for the D minor 9, making the voicing important for the voice leading? That makes me wonder if there's another D minor 9 voicing that would overlap that minor third, the 7th fret on the high E, right? But if you still chose the other voicing for a stronger effect. Okay, so let me see if I get this straight. So for that first part of the question, Eyes with No Face is basically talking about how we have, how I was saying how I was using this A7 sharp 5 to resolve down to the D minor 9. Now, the point is made here, which is a really good point. If I wasn't doing a minor 9 chord, and I was just doing a normal minor 7 chord, that interval would actually be staying stagnant between those 2 chords, right? And so to this point, yes, when I was doing that minor 9 chord, this, I really liked the voice leading of having both of these 2 notes up a half step and then resolve down a half step, right? Now, this 9 is still, or this minor third is still within that D minor 9 chord, right? It's just an octave down. So it is a specific way that I wanted to voice lead it where, again, I could have still played, which is perfectly fine, right? It's actually kind of cool if you're, again, going for that effect where you want that top voice to stay the same between the 2 chords, but I wanted a little bit of resolution happening in the top voice. So because I was using a D minor 9 chord for the majority of it, and I just like the sound of it, I like the shine and shimmer, I wanted to resolve down to that 9 because I really like that sound of resolution. And in the second part of the question, let me just reread this one more time as well. The minor third on fret of the high E string. So on the 7th, so the 7th fret on the high E, but you'd still choose the other voicing for a stronger hair. Let me read that just one more time. That makes me wonder if there's another D minor 9 voicing that would overlap that minor 3rd, 7th fret of the high E, right? But you'd still choose the other voicing. Okay, so is there another voicing where we'd be kind of keeping that sharp 5 the same between those two, right? So this is actually a really interesting question. So let's see if we can figure something out, right? So before, I was using this sharp voicing, and again, I could, to play a D minor 9, I could also do something like this. Now this is a little bit of a more advanced voicing. I wouldn't just recommend anybody try it if you're, you know, already just kind of getting used to some of these extensions. But what I'm basically doing here is I'm deciding to put this 9 right here instead of my flat 7. And you can hear this one can also be a little tricky if your guitar is not perfectly intonated like this one apparently isn't. It does kind of create a little bit of tension with points, but regardless, because there's going to be some closer intervals happening here. But anyway, I could technically use this chord as a resolution going to that minor 3rd to keep it the same. Or, you know, for instance, if I wanted to play this same chord up here and do some sort of sharp 5 chord. So I could do something like this. So this is actually a sharp 9 and a sharp 5. Again, getting a little crazy with some of these voicings, but just for our purposes of answering the question. I could do something like that. So what I'm doing is I'm having my sharp 5 at the top, and then I'm keeping it the same with the resolution, and then in the 9 in the bottom. But again, for our purposes, I really like the sound of that sharp 5 going down to the 9. You know, it's just something that's been used a lot, and just because of our, you know, familiarity with music and, you know, standards and all of these things that make their way into our kind of common culture of how we understand chord progressions, I just always prefer that sound of it resolving down to the 9. But that's always, again, completely up to you. If you say, you know what, I really like that sound of that kind of stagnant 3rd, you can definitely do that. And that's partially one of the reasons why this alteration works, is because we know that that note is going to be within the next chord. All right, and that looks like it was our last question. So again, I'd just like to thank anybody who's made it all the way to the end of this course with me. Thank you so much if, you know, you got some information out of this. And again, if you're someone that's skipping around too, that's also awesome. I hope you get some good information skipping around, and I've tried to structure it so that, you know, even though this is a sequential course, there's good information in each individual lesson that won't just require you to go step by step, or, you know, won't just explicitly reference information that you wouldn't be able to figure out in each individual lesson. So again, thank you so much for making it all the way to the bitter end of this course with me, and I will see you in the next course.